Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're heading deep into the dark heart of the American South, a place of beauty and unbearable cruelty. Before we begin, take a second, hit that subscribe button, because every week, we uncover another buried truth the history books tried to forget. And trust me, tonight's story is one you'll never forget. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is as you hear this voice. Let's see who's tuning in from the farthest corner of the world. Now, imagine this. A grand plantation home standing proud in Charleston, South Carolina. White magnolias bloom outside, their scent thick in the humid air. Inside, a widow sits by the window, staring at her daughters, not with love, but with calculation. Because she's about to use them, in a way no mother ever should. 1836, Charleston. A mother, desperate to save her fortune. Two daughters, innocent, obedient, trapped in her schemes. And dozens of enslaved men, forced into something unspeakable. This was not a story of rebellion. Not a war. But something quieter, colder. The kind of evil that hides behind lace curtains and polite smiles. They called her the widow of Charleston. And what she did behind those walls would haunt generations. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll question what desperation can make a person do. Before she became the widow of Charleston, she was simply Margaret Ellis, the daughter of a wealthy rice merchant who believed women existed only to preserve a man's fortune. She grew up in the grand parlors of Charleston, a city where charm covered cruelty, and money often came soaked in sweat and blood. Her father traded rice, cotton, and people. And as a little girl, Margaret watched the business of human lives from behind lace curtains, the auctions, the cries, the chains, all treated like the sound of commerce. By the time she was 16, she could read, write, and play the piano. But she was never taught kindness. Her lessons were different. How to smile when a man insults you. How to pretend not to notice suffering. How to survive in a world built by men, for men. And when she turned 18, her father made sure she married well. That's when Colonel James Beaumont entered her life. The colonel was everything a Southern family could want, rich, connected, and ruthless. He owned one of the largest plantations outside Charleston, over 200 enslaved men and women working the rice fields under the Carolina sun. He promised Margaret safety, luxury, and respect. But behind closed doors, the colonel was a tyrant. His voice carried more fear than his whip. Servants learned to move silently when they heard his boots on the floorboards. Margaret soon realized that her marriage was not love, it was a cage gilded in gold. He controlled everything, her letters, her friends, her appearance. He called her my porcelain queen, but treated her like property. At dinner, she smiled for guests. At night, she cried into her pillow so softly that even the wind couldn't hear her. 2 years later, she gave birth to her first daughter, Eliza. Then another, Catherine. Those girls were her light, her reason to breathe. But the colonel saw them as future assets, potential brides to strengthen alliances, expand land, and preserve the Beaumont name. For 15 years, Margaret played her role perfectly. The devoted wife. The elegant hostess. The quiet woman who never questioned her husband in public. But behind that grace, something darker was brewing. A quiet resentment, a hunger for control she'd never been allowed to have. Every lash she heard, every cry she ignored, hardened her heart a little more. When her husband suddenly fell ill in 1835, a fever that burned through him within days, Margaret stood by his bedside, holding his hand. The doctor said he was beyond saving. And as he took his last breath, she whispered something no one else heard. "Now, James, let's see how I run things." For the first time in her life, she was free. But freedom in Charleston came with a price. Widows in the South were pitted, but not respected. They couldn't inherit titles or power outright. They could own property, yes, but only if they could keep it profitable. And the Beaumont plantation was bleeding money. The cotton yield had fallen. The rice fields were rotting from floodwaters. Bankers began circling like vultures, demanding payments her husband never made. At night, Margaret sat alone at the grand dining table, empty now except for candlelight and unpaid bills. The laughter that once filled that house was gone. Even the slaves seemed to move slower, watching her with quiet curiosity. For the first time, Margaret realized she was surrounded by people who did not fear her, they pitied her. And that pity burned. Because Margaret Beaumont had spent her entire life watching men control everything, her father, her husband, even her fate. Now, she refused to be the next fallen widow begging charity from the church. She told herself she'd do whatever it took to preserve the Beaumont name. Whatever it took, to survive. But survival has a cost. And soon, she would learn that line between desperation and evil was thinner than she ever imagined. Her daughters, Eliza and Catherine, became her lifeline. Eliza was quiet, gentle, with eyes that carried her father's blue and her mother's pain. Catherine was curious, full of questions, still untouched by the cold logic of survival. Margaret looked at them and saw more than family. She saw opportunity. A way to rebuild what was lost. A way to turn weakness into wealth. And that's when something changed in her eyes, a spark that wasn't motherly love, but a kind of ruthless clarity. Because in the twisted world of Charleston's slave economy, the body itself could become currency. She began reading, asking questions, not about farming or trade, but about slave prices. About what made one human worth more than another. And in those ledgers, she found her answer. Children. The younger, the lighter, the better. Each one, a profit on paper. Each one, a transaction that no one would question. They say greed grows slowly, like rot behind polished wood. You never see it at first. But once it takes hold, it consumes everything. By the spring of 1836, Margaret had become someone unrecognizable. Her smiles had meaning again, but they weren't warm. Her words, once polite and poised, now carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. And her daughters would soon learn that their mother's love had a price. That was the beginning of Charleston's darkest secret. The beginning of a mother's descent. And the birth of a legacy no one dared to speak aloud. The spring of 1836 came heavy and humid, the kind of Charleston heat that makes the air itself feel alive. The rice fields shimmered in the distance, but the house was silent. Inside the Beaumont estate, the widow Margaret Beaumont sat at her husband's old desk, surrounded by ledgers, receipts, and fading ink. Every line was the same story: loss. Debts. Decline. A once golden empire turning to dust. The banks refused her loans. The merchants stopped extending credit. And behind her fine manners, Charleston society whispered. The widow can't manage. She'll lose it all before Christmas. She'd smile in public, but in private, her hand trembled as she poured her wine. That's when she began visiting the slave markets. At first, she went quietly, under the guise of estate business. But her servants noticed. She'd return late, her gloves stained with dust, her eyes colder than when she left. Margaret was learning. Watching. Calculating. And what she saw there, changed everything. In Charleston's back alleys, beyond the grand auction houses, there were private deals, whispered transactions away from the public eye. There, wealthy widows and merchants traded in what they called the future of the trade. Children. Light-skinned, mixed children, born of the hidden unions between masters and their enslaved women. They fetched higher prices, sold as house servants, seamstresses, or nannies. To them, a drop of European blood meant profit. Margaret listened. She watched. And she understood. A terrible thought took root in her mind, the kind of thought you can't ever unthink. That night, as rain tapped against the tall windows, Margaret called for her overseer, Mr. Tully, a man whose loyalty was bought long ago. Tell me, she said, her voice calm, her eyes distant. Do you know what makes a body valuable? The overseer hesitated. Strong arms, ma'am. Good health. She smiled faintly. No. Rarity. The right kind of rarity can make a fortune. The man didn't understand then. But he would. Days later, Margaret began making changes to the plantation. She had the female slaves separated by age, health, and strength. The men, inspected. Sorted. Assigned. She recorded every name, every birth, every death. And soon, she gave her daughters a new set of rules. Eliza, the eldest, was 17 now, gentle and soft-spoken. She used to read poetry in the garden. But her mother took away her books. "Reading won't save us," Margaret said. "You will." Catherine, barely 15, followed her mother like a shadow, trying to understand what was happening. But there were things no child should ever understand. The daughters were forbidden to leave the house. The plantation gates were locked after dusk. And every night, Margaret would sit them at the dining table, lit by a single candle, and talk of duty. She said, "We are not victims of this world. We use it before it uses us." Her voice trembled not with sadness, but with conviction. That was the moment she began to believe the lies she was telling herself. The enslaved workers knew something was wrong long before the neighbors did. The fields grew quieter. Conversation stopped when footsteps approached. At night, strange orders were given, pairings arranged, punishments carried out for disobedience that no one understood. Then came the nights of screams, muffled, desperate, cut short by morning. And the next day, the widow would emerge from her chambers dressed in black silk, her daughters silent behind her. She told them it was God's plan. She said they were saving the plantation. But salvation built on suffering isn't salvation at all. Eliza's health began to fade. Her skin paled, her spirit dimmed. She'd stare at her mother across the breakfast table, her eyes hollow, as if searching for the woman who once brushed her hair and kissed her goodnight. But that mother was gone. Replaced by something colder. And Catherine watched in silence. The younger sister began keeping a journal, small, hidden under her mattress, writing about the nights she couldn't sleep, the voices she heard, the fear that hung in the halls. She wrote, "Mama prays more than she sleeps now. But her prayers don't sound holy anymore." Outside the Beaumont plantation, rumors spread like wildfire. A doctor refused to visit after sunset. A priest stopped answering her letters. Even the other widows in town began to cross the street when they saw her coming. But no one confronted her. No one dared. Because Margaret Beaumont had influence, and influence, in Charleston, was as sacred as God. Still, something strange was happening within those gates. A new overseer arrived. Men came and went in the night. Wagons were seen heading toward the docks before dawn, carrying small, covered crates that never returned. And inside those crates, were records. Names. Infants. Secrets. By the end of 1836, Margaret had made back nearly all the money she'd lost. The plantation was thriving again. But her soul, and her daughters, were gone. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the halls at night, the servants swore they heard a woman weeping, and 2 girls praying in the dark. And on those nights, even the strongest men refused to walk near the house. Because they all knew something evil lived there now. Not a ghost. Not a curse. But a woman, who had traded her humanity for survival. By early 1837, the widow Beaumont's name had become legend in Charleston's whispers. She had everything again, power, money, control. But the cost was unimaginable. Her daughters were shadows of who they once were. The enslaved men walked the fields with hollow eyes, their songs turned to silence. And yet, the widow slept soundly. Because she believed what she was doing was necessary. And the most terrifying part? The world around her, let her believe it. But all darkness grows too heavy to hide. And soon, something, or someone, would break. Because even in a house built on sin, there comes a night when the truth refuses to stay buried. That night, was coming. By the summer of 1837, the Beaumont house was different. It was too quiet. Too clean. Too perfect. No laughter. No song. Just the soft echo of footsteps through long, empty halls, and the whispers that crawled through the cracks at night. Margaret Beaumont had turned her plantation into a machine, precise, profitable, heartless. But even machines can break. Because something inside that house had begun to rot. Eliza stopped eating. Catherine stopped speaking. And the mother, the once beautiful widow, spent her nights staring into the mirror, as if searching for the person she used to be. Servants said they'd seen her whisper to her reflection. Others swore she spoke to someone who wasn't there. Her hair, once bright and golden, now hung in dull gray strands, like the moss on the old oaks that lined the road to the river. The same river where, once upon a time, people came and went in chains. Now, it carried secrets. One stormy night, a scream tore through the Beaumont estate. A young housemaid, barely 16, had vanished. By morning, her quarters were empty, her bed soaked, her dress torn, her shoes still beside the door. Margaret called it runaway nonsense. But the others, they knew. They whispered that the house itself was taking them. That something evil lived under its roof, and that the widow no longer feared God. If you've made it this far, take a breath. Because this is where the story turns, where history and horror begin to blur. Before we go deeper into what really happened inside that Charleston house, I want you to do something. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten. If you believe the past still whispers lessons we can't afford to ignore, then take a second right now, and subscribe. Not for numbers. Not for fame. But because every time you do, you help keep stories like this alive. Stories that most people would rather bury. And when you subscribe, hit that bell too, so you'll know when the next untold truth drops. Because what's coming next will test everything you think you know about mercy, motherhood, and evil. The widow of Charleston thought her sins would stay hidden within her walls. But soon, one of her own would turn against her. And that betrayal would uncover a secret so vile, it nearly burned Charleston to the ground. By the summer of 1836, Charleston was suffocating under the heat, not just the kind that burned skin, but the kind that burned souls. Rumors began to drift through the narrow cobbled streets, whispered between house servants and stable boys. People said something unholy was happening behind the widow's iron gates. The townsfolk called her Miss Eleanor the Kind in daylight. But under candlelight, her name became a curse. One evening, a young enslaved woman named Ruth vanished. She was just 16, her eyes always tired, her laughter fragile as glass. 3 days later, she was found dead near the marshes, her body cold, and a strange symbol carved into her shoulder, a mark of ownership. The widow said nothing. The sheriff said nothing. And the town pretended not to see. But whispers spread faster than truth. They said Eleanor had lost her mind, believing that through her daughter's wounds, she could rebuild a pure and loyal generation. Her twisted grief had turned into a science of sin. She would pair her daughters with chosen enslaved men, forcing them to conceive, to create children she'd sell for profit and control. The townspeople began noticing something strange, babies born too often, too quickly, and the widow's fortune growing faster than any plantation in Charleston. And her daughters? They were seen less and less. Eleanor had locked them away, one in the upper chambers, one in the carriage house, and one, never seen again. Until one night, a fire broke out in the slave quarters. The flames lit up the sky, red and merciless, like the truth demanding to be seen. Amid the chaos, one of Eleanor's daughters, Clara, escaped through the smoke, clutching a newborn in her arms. She ran, barefoot, bloodied, desperate, her white gown torn and blackened by soot. Behind her, the mansion groaned as wood cracked and windows shattered. And in that fire, it said Eleanor stood in the doorway, unmoving, staring into the inferno with a calm that chilled every witness. When dawn came, the mansion was ash. Bodies were found, but not all. Eleanor's corpse was never recovered. Some said she fled. Others, that the devil finally came to collect his due. But the baby Clara carried. He lived. And his descendants would later tell the story, of how Charleston's sweet widow had turned her grief into a nightmare that haunted bloodlines for generations. And that, my friends, was the night Charleston's secret was born into fire. When the sun rose over Charleston the next morning, the fire was gone. But something deeper still smoldered, in silence, in shame, and in memory. The widow's mansion was nothing but black bones, a charred skeleton of what once stood proud. The townsfolk gathered near the ashes, whispering prayers they didn't believe and crossing themselves for sins they didn't commit. They called it an accident. A candle, a careless hand, the will of God, anything but the truth. But Clara, she never returned. Weeks later, a fisherman found her washed-up shawl near the edge of Stono River, but not her body. Some said she fled north, the baby in her arms, hidden among abolitionist sympathizers. Others believed she drowned, trying to cross into freedom that never came. And the child? A baby boy, with eyes said to mirror both the darkness of his grandfather and the sorrow of his mother. He grew up far from Charleston, raised by strangers who never spoke of the past. But blood has a memory. And the story, her story, refused to die. Years turned into decades. The Civil War came and went, tearing open the very soil that had hidden so many buried sins. Families fell, plantations crumbled, fortunes disappeared. And Charleston rebuilt herself, brick by brick, chandelier by chandelier, until her streets shined again. But beneath that polish, beneath those magnolia-lined avenues, lay ghosts that never rested. There are letters, preserved in private family archives, written by Charleston's elite in the late 1800s. Letters that hint at what truly happened that summer of 1836. One, from a clergyman, reads: "May God forgive what was done in that house, and may the children never remember whose blood they carry." For over a century, the tale of the widow of Charleston lived only in whispers. In bedtime warnings. In half-remembered hymns sung by those who once worked her fields. They said on quiet nights, if you walked near the old marsh where her mansion once stood, you could hear a woman humming a lullaby. And the faint cry of a child that never stopped weeping. But perhaps, the most haunting truth isn't in the fire, or the breeding, or the blood. Perhaps it's in what Charleston chose to forget, and what we choose to remember. Because behind every gilded name, every historic home tour, every painting of Southern gentility, there's a story like Eleanor's, a story of pain polished into silence. The widow. Her daughters. The child who survived. They are not legends. They were people, flesh and blood, caught in a world where grief became greed, and motherhood became machinery. And history? It buried them. Just like it buried so many others. But tonight, you heard it. You felt it. And that means, they are not forgotten. History doesn't always whisper through pages, sometimes, it bleeds through the walls of old houses. And sometimes, it speaks through us, the ones willing to listen. What happened in Charleston in 1836 was more than a tragedy. It was a mirror, showing how far grief can twist the human heart when the world refuses to let it heal. The widow of Charleston tried to build immortality through pain. But what she truly left behind, was a story. A warning. And tonight, you became a keeper of that story. Every time someone remembers, speaks their names, or feels the ache of their silence, their ghosts grow lighter. So if this story stayed with you, if it stirred something deep, or made you question what lies behind Charleston's beauty, I want you to do something simple. Hit that subscribe button, not just for stories like this, but for the truths buried under centuries of dust. Turn on the notification bell, because the next untold story might be one history tried to erase completely. Before you go, tell me in the comments. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Was it the widow's grief, or what she became? Or was it Charleston's silence, the choice to bury sin under silken song? I read every comment, every thought, every question, because your voice keeps these forgotten souls alive. And remember, every story I tell isn't just about the past. It's about the people who lived it, the pain they carried, and the light we can bring by remembering them. So stay curious. Stay human. And, stay until the next story. Because the truth has many faces. And some are still waiting to be seen.